Eleanor Hart had not returned to Pinewood Cemetery in 3 years, not since the day they lowered her husband into the ground beneath a sky so grey it felt like the world itself was mourning. Thomas Hart, Tommy to his brothers, my anchor to her, died on a rain-slicked highway in October 2022, his motorcycle sliding out from under him on a curve he'd taken 1,000 times before. The club had come to the funeral, 67 riders in leather and denim, standing silent as statues while the chaplain spoke. But after that day, Eleanor had retreated into herself. She sold the house. She stopped answering calls. She let the world fade to white noise. But today, October 28th, 2025, something pulled her back. Maybe it was the date. Maybe it was the dream she'd had the night before, where Tommy stood at the foot of her bed and smiled that crooked smile he always wore when he knew something she didn't. Whatever it was, she found herself driving the old service road toward the cemetery at dawn, her hands trembling on the wheel. She parked near the entrance and walked the gravel path alone, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers she'd picked from the roadside. The morning was cold and still. Frost clung to the headstones like lace. She rounded the corner toward Tommy's plot and stopped dead in her tracks. 13 motorcycles were parked in a perfect semicircle around his grave, chrome gleaming in the early light, engines still ticking as they cooled. And standing beside them, arms crossed, faces weathered and unreadable, were 13 men she hadn't seen in years. The Iron Vow Motorcycle Club, Tommy's brothers, his family, the ones who had called and texted and knocked on her door until she stopped answering, the ones she thought had forgotten. Eleanor's knees buckled, the flowers fell from her hands, and as the sun broke over the ridge, she realized they had never forgotten at all. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next chapters of this story. Eleanor hadn't planned to come back. Not today. Not ever, if she was being honest with herself. For 3 years, she had avoided this place like it was cursed. And maybe it was. Pinewood Cemetery sat on the eastern edge of town, surrounded by towering pine trees that whispered when the wind blew through their branches and cast long, melancholy shadows, even at noon. It was peaceful, quiet, the kind of place people said was restful when they didn't know what else to say. But Eleanor knew better. There was no rest here, only absence, only the cold, unchanging fact that the man she'd loved for 22 years was 6 feet below the earth and never coming back. No matter how many times she told herself to accept it, her heart refused to believe. She pulled her aging sedan into the gravel parking lot just after dawn. The sky was pale and colorless, caught somewhere between night and morning, and the air was sharp with the smell of frost and wet leaves and earth that had been turned recently for new graves. She sat behind the wheel for a long time, hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Breath fogging the windshield glass, her heart was pounding against her ribs like it was trying to escape. Her stomach twisted in knots so tight she felt nauseous. She didn't know why she'd come. She only knew that she had to, that something had called her here, something she couldn't name or explain or ignore. The dream had woken her at 4 in the morning. Tommy, standing at the foot of her bed, wearing his old leather jacket, the one with the Iron Vow patch on the back and the worn elbows and the smell of motor oil and cigarettes that never quite washed out. He was smiling, that crooked, knowing smile that always made her feel like everything would be okay, even when the world was falling apart around them. He didn't say anything. He just looked at her with those warm brown eyes, the ones that had convinced her to marry him after only 6 months of dating, the ones that had seen her through miscarriages and job losses and her mother's funeral. And then he turned and walked toward the door, his boots making no sound on the hardwood floor, and she knew with a certainty that made her chest ache that he wanted her to follow. So here she was, 3 years after his death, 3 years after she'd sworn she'd never come back to this place. Eleanor climbed out of the car and pulled her wool coat tight around her shoulders. The air bit at her cheeks and made her eyes water. The gravel crunched under her boots with every step, loud in the morning silence. She carried a small bouquet of wildflowers, nothing fancy, nothing from a florist. Just the kind Tommy used to pick for her when they went riding together in the hills outside town. Purple asters, goldenrod, wild sage. She'd found them growing along the roadside on the way here, their petals still wet with dew and trembling in the early light. The path wound through rows of headstones, some new and polished to a mirror shine, others weathered and forgotten, their inscriptions worn smooth by decades of rain and wind. She walked slowly, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts that misted in the cold air. Her pulse hammered in her ears so loudly she couldn't hear the birds beginning to sing in the trees. She hadn't been here since the funeral, hadn't been able to face it, the thought of standing over that grave, reading his name carved into cold stone, acknowledging that he was really gone and never coming back. It was too much. It made it real, and she wasn't ready for it to be real. Wasn't sure she'd ever be ready. But now, 3 years later, something had changed. Maybe it was time, maybe it was grief, finally loosening its stranglehold on her throat. Maybe it was just exhaustion. The bone-deep, soul-crushing kind that comes from running too long from something you can never outrun. Whatever it was, her feet kept moving forward. One step, then another, until she rounded the corner near the old oak tree, the one that marked the western edge of the cemetery, its branches bare and skeletal against the pale sky. Tommy's grave was just beyond it, tucked beneath a stand of pines where the morning light filtered through in golden shafts. She knew the spot by heart. She'd chosen it herself, standing there in a black dress with mascara running down her cheeks, while the funeral director waited patiently with his clipboard, a place where the sun came through in the mornings. A place where the wind moved the branches and made them sound like the ocean, the way Tommy always said it did when they camped in the mountains. And then she saw them. Eleanor stopped walking so abruptly she nearly stumbled. Her breath caught in her throat like a fist had closed around her windpipe. Her vision blurred at the edges, darkness creeping in from the sides. For a moment, she thought she was hallucinating. That grief had finally broken her mind the way it had threatened to so many times before. 13 motorcycles were parked in a perfect semicircle around Tommy's grave. Chrome and steel, gleaming in the pale morning light, like they'd been polished just for this moment. Black leather saddlebags hanging heavy with road dust. Worn handlebars wrapped in tape and prayer beads and faded bandanas, engines still ticking softly as they cooled, making little metallic pinging sounds that echoed in the stillness. And standing beside them, silent and unmoving as monuments, were 13 men in black leather jackets with the iron vow patch stitched across the back, the skull with wings, the broken chain, the words "loyalty beyond death" embroidered in crimson thread that looked almost black in the dim light. Tommy's club, his brothers, the men he'd ridden with for 15 years, the men he'd called family more often than he'd called his own blood relatives. Eleanor's legs went weak beneath her. The wildflowers slipped from her nerveless fingers and scattered across the gravel path, purple and gold against grey stone. She grabbed the nearest headstone to steady herself, her palm pressed flat against cold granite, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might shatter her ribs from the inside. A sound escaped her throat, something between a gasp and a sob that she couldn't control. They were all there, every single one of them. Hawk, the club president, standing at the center with his arms crossed over his broad chest and his silver-grey hair tied back in a ponytail. Reaper, the enforcer, tall and silent as a shadow, his face hidden behind dark sunglasses, even though the sun had barely risen. Preacher, whose real name was Samuel, but who never went by it because he'd been a chaplain in the army before he came home broken and found salvation on 2 wheels. Gunner with his tattooed neck and missing finger. Nomad with his white beard and road-worn face. Chains with his scarred knuckles and gentle eyes, all of them, The men who had stood at Tommy's funeral 3 years ago and watched him be lowered into the ground while a bagpiper played Amazing Grace and Eleanor collapsed into her sister's arms. The men who had called her every week for 6 months, leaving voicemails she'd never returned. The men who had knocked on her door with casseroles and offers of help until she stopped answering, and they finally gave up. The men she thought had moved on with their lives and forgotten about the widow who'd shut them out. But they hadn't moved on. They were here, and they had brought his memory with them like a sacred relic. Hawk was the first to move. He uncrossed his arms and took a single step forward, his boots crunching on the gravel. His face was weathered and lined, the face of a man who'd seen too much road and too many brothers buried. But his eyes were kind. They'd always been kind. "Eleanor," he said. His voice was low and rough, like gravel rolling in a barrel, but there was something gentle in it, something that made her want to cry all over again. She couldn't speak. Her throat had closed completely. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to press them against her thighs to make them stop. She just stared at them, at all 13 of them, standing there in the cold morning air like sentinels guarding something precious, like they'd been waiting for her, like they'd known she'd come. "We didn't mean to scare you," Hawk said, and his voice softened just a fraction, the way it used to when Tommy brought her to the clubhouse and she'd felt out of place among all that leather and chrome and testosterone. "We came to pay respects. Same as you." Eleanor swallowed hard, trying to force words past the lump in her throat. Her vision swam with unshed tears. She looked past them, past their broad shoulders and crossed arms, toward Tommy's grave. The headstone was simple, black granite polished to a mirror shine, nothing fancy, because Tommy had never been fancy about anything except his bike. His name was carved deep into the stone, Thomas Michael Hart. His dates March 15th, 1978, October 12th, 2022. And beneath that, the words she'd chosen after sitting in the funeral home for 2 hours, unable to think, unable to breathe. He rode with honor. He died free. But today, the grave wasn't simple. It wasn't the stark, lonely plot she'd left behind 3 years ago. It was covered in flowers, dozens and dozens of them, roses in deep reds and whites, lilies with their heavy, sweet perfume, carnations in every color, wildflowers like the ones now scattered at her feet. They were piled against the headstone, laid carefully in rows, tucked into the grass around the edges, and lying across the base of the stone, draped like a blanket or a flag, was Tommy's old riding jacket, the one he'd been wearing the day he died. The leather was cracked and faded, stained with old rain and older memories. The patches were worn smooth from years of wind and road, but it was his. She'd recognize it anywhere. She'd held it 1,000 times, pressed her face into it and breathed in his scent, worn it herself on cold nights when she missed him so badly she couldn't sleep. "How?" Her voice came out broken and raw, barely more than a whisper. She cleared her throat and tried again, forcing the words out even though they hurt. "How did you get that?" I thought it was destroyed in the accident. Preacher stepped forward. He was a big man, broad-shouldered and grey-bearded, with hands like bear paws and eyes that always looked sad, even when he was smiling. He'd been the one to speak at Tommy's funeral, his voice steady and strong when everyone else was falling apart. "The police gave it to us," he said quietly, "after the investigation closed. They asked if anyone wanted it for the memorial service. We took it. We've been keeping it safe, bringing it here every year." "Every year." Eleanor's voice cracked on the words. Hawk nodded slowly. "Every year. Same day. October 28th. The day Tommy joined the club 15 years ago. We come here. We bring flowers. We sit with him. We make sure he's not alone." He paused, and something flickered across his weathered face. Grief, maybe, or regret. "We make sure he knows we didn't forget." Eleanor's knees buckled. She couldn't hold herself up anymore. She sank down onto the cold, dew-wet grass, her hands pressed to her mouth as if she could physically hold back the sobs that were tearing their way up from her chest. Tears streamed down her face, hot against her frozen cheeks. She couldn't stop them, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The weight of it, the knowledge that these men had been here year after year, while she had stayed away like a coward, crushed her beneath its impossible mass. "We tried to reach you," Hawk said, and now there was something raw in his voice, something that made him sound younger than his 57 years. He knelt down in front of her, his knees cracking audibly, bringing himself to her level so she had to look at him. "Called, texted, came by the house. Hell, Eleanor, we must have left 50 voicemails, but after a while—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "After a while, we figured you needed space, that maybe seeing us made it worse, that we reminded you of what you'd lost. So we gave you that space, we backed off. But we never forgot him, and we sure as hell never forgot you." Reaper stepped forward, moving with that silent, predatory grace that had always unnerved her a little. He was the quietest of them all, a man who spoke maybe 10 words a day if you were lucky, who communicated more with looks and nods and the set of his shoulders than with actual language. But now he knelt beside Eleanor, his leather jacket creaking, and placed one large hand on her shoulder. His grip was firm, steady, real. Warm through her coat. "He was our brother," Reaper said, and his voice was surprisingly gentle, like gravel wrapped in velvet. "That don't end. Not with death, not with time, not with distance. You loved him. We loved him. That's enough. That's everything." Eleanor sobbed harder. She doubled over, her forehead pressed to the cold, wet earth, her fingers digging into the grass, and let the grief pour out of her like water from a broken dam that had finally given way under too much pressure. She had held it in for so long, held it all in. The anger at God for taking him, the loneliness that ate at her in the middle of the night, the guilt for still being alive when he wasn't, the desperate clawing need to hear his voice just one more time. And now, surrounded by these men, these rough, scarred, tattooed strangers who were not strangers at all, she finally let it go. Let it all go. Hawk knelt beside her on her other side. Preacher did the same. And then, one by one, all 13 of them lowered themselves to the ground around Tommy's grave, forming a circle. They didn't speak. They didn't try to comfort her with empty platitudes or meaningless assurances that everything would be okay. They just sat there in the cold morning light with frost melting on their leather jackets and held space for her grief, bore witness to it, honored it the way they'd honor a fallen brother. And for the first time in 3 years, for the first time since the night she'd gotten the phone call that shattered her world, Eleanor didn't feel alone. The sun climbed higher. Birds began to sing in the pine trees. Somewhere in the distance, a car started. Life went on around them, but in that small circle of leather and chrome and shared sorrow, time stood still. If you're watching from your city, drop a comment and let us know. We'd love to hear from you. When Eleanor finally lifted her head, the sun had climbed higher in the sky and burned away the last remnants of frost. The world was waking up around them. She could hear traffic in the distance, the hum of tires on asphalt, a lawnmower starting somewhere beyond the cemetery gates. Normal sounds. Life continuing like Tommy hadn't died, like the world hadn't ended 3 years ago on a rain-slicked highway curve. She wiped her face with the back of her hand, smearing tears and mascara across her cheek. Her eyes felt swollen and raw. Her throat ached from crying, but something inside her chest had loosened, some tight, painful knot that had been there so long she'd forgotten what it felt like to breathe without it. The men around her hadn't moved, hadn't left. They'd just waited, patient as the stones around them, giving her all the time she needed. Why today? Eleanor asked finally, her voice hoarse and rough like she'd been screaming. Why specifically October 28th, I thought. I thought it was just a random day to you. Hawke glanced at the others, some silent communication passing between them that she couldn't read. Then he looked back at her, his weathered face solemn. It's the day he joined the club, he said. 15 years ago, October 28th, 2010. He walked into our clubhouse with nothing but a rusted-out Harley that barely ran and a grin that could light up a room. Kid was 24 years old and didn't know the first thing about what it meant to be in an MC. But he had heart, and he had loyalty. You could see it in him. Hawke smiled, and it transformed his face, made him look younger. Said he wanted to ride with men who still believed in something, who stood for something. We took him in, taught him the ropes, how to read the road, how to watch your brother's back, how to live by the code. And he became one of us. Best damn rider we ever had. Fearless, but smart about it, you know? Never took stupid risks. Always made sure everyone got home safe. Preacher nodded, his eyes distant with memory. Every year since he died, we've come here on this day, anniversary of the day he became Iron Vow, to remember, to honor him, to keep the promise we made when he patched in, that we'd be brothers until the end, and beyond. What promise? Eleanor whispered, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know, wasn't sure she could handle knowing. Hawke reached into his jacket, the leather creaking with the movement, and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was worn and creased, the edges frayed and soft from being handled many times. He unfolded it carefully, like it was something precious, and handed it to her. Eleanor took it with trembling hands. The paper was lined notebook paper torn from a spiral. The ink was blue ballpoint. And the handwriting, God, the handwriting, was Tommy's. That familiar scrawl with the letters that slanted to the right and the way he always crossed his T's too high. She'd seen it on grocery lists and birthday cards and love notes tucked into her lunch bag. She'd thought she'd never see it again. The note was short, direct, so very Tommy. Brothers, if anything happens to me out there on the road, I need you to promise me something. Make sure Eleanor knows she's not alone. Make sure she knows the club's got her back, always, no matter what. Even if she pushes you away, even if she says she doesn't need help, be there, because she's going to need you, even if she doesn't know it yet. She's my whole world. Take care of her for me. Tommy Eleanor's breath hitched in her chest. She read it again. And again, the words blurred as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks and dripped onto the paper, making the ink run slightly. Her hands shook so badly the paper rattled. He wrote that 6 months before he died, Hawke said quietly, his voice gentle as if he was afraid of breaking her. March 2022. Gave it to me one night after church. That's what we call our weekly meetings. Said he had a bad feeling, that something wasn't right. We laughed it off, told him he was being paranoid, that he'd been watching too many true crime shows with you. Hawke's voice caught slightly, but he was serious, dead serious. He made us swear, all of us, every man in the club, that if something happened, we'd look after you, that we'd make sure you were okay, that you'd always have family. Eleanor looked up at him through her tears, her vision swimming. But I shut you out. I wouldn't answer your calls. I changed my number. I moved. Her voice broke. I was horrible to you. All of you. You were grieving, Reaper said simply, as if that explained everything. And maybe it did. We understood. Still do. Gunnar spoke up for the first time, his voice surprisingly soft for someone who looked so hard. Tattoos crawled up his neck and across his knuckles, and a scar bisected his left eyebrow, but his eyes were kind. My old lady left me when our son died. Car accident. Kid was 6. She couldn't look at me anymore, couldn't stand to be in the same house, because I reminded her of what we'd lost. I understood that. Loved her anyway, still do. So when you shut us out, We got it. We figured you'd come back when you were ready. Or you wouldn't. Either way, we'd keep the promise. That's what brothers do." Eleanor clutched the note to her chest, pressing it against her heart like it could somehow transfer Tommy's words directly into her bloodstream. She looked down at his grave, at the jacket lying across the stone like a guardian, at the flowers surrounding it in their rainbow of colors, and a fresh wave of emotion crashed over her. He had known, somehow, 6 months before that rainy October night. Tommy had known, had felt it coming, and he had made sure she wouldn't be forgotten, wouldn't be alone, even in death. He was still protecting her. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice breaking. There aren't words for this." "You don't have to say anything," Hawk said gently. He stood, his knees cracking, and extended a hand to help her up. "But there's something else, something we've been holding on to, waiting for the right time to give it to you." Eleanor took his hand and rose to her feet on shaky legs. Her whole body felt heavy, wrung out, like she'd run a marathon. Hawk walked over to his motorcycle, a massive black and chrome beast with worn leather saddlebags, and pulled a small wooden box from one of the compartments. The box was simple, made of dark walnut, with brass hinges that gleamed in the sunlight. He brought it back and held it out to her with both hands, like an offering. "This was Tommy's," he said. "We've been holding on to it, waiting for the right time, waiting for you." Eleanor took the box. It was heavier than it looked, solid, real. Her hands shook as she lifted the lid, the hinges squeaking softly. Inside, nestled in dark velvet, was Tommy's riding ring, the one he'd worn every single day since he joined the club 15 years ago. Silver, thick and heavy, with the iron vow insignia engraved on the face, a skull with wings, a broken chain. The metal was worn smooth on the sides from years of gripping handlebars. She could see the small dent on one side where he'd punched a wall during an argument they'd had 5 years ago, then immediately apologized with tears in his eyes. And beside the ring, folded carefully, was a bandana, blue and white paisley, the one he'd worn on their last ride together 2 weeks before he died. They'd gone up into the mountains, just the two of them, and watched the sunset from a ridge, while eating gas station sandwiches and drinking lukewarm beer. He'd tied this bandana around his forehead to keep his hair out of his eyes, and she'd laughed at him because he looked like a refugee from the 1960s. He'd kissed her to shut her up, and they'd made love right there on the mountainside, with the sky turning purple above them and the world spread out below like a promise. "He wanted you to have them," Preacher said softly, his deep voice gentle. "Told us before he died, made us promise, said if anything happened, we should make sure these got to you, that you'd know what they meant, that they'd help you remember the good times, not just the end." Eleanor's hands shook so badly she almost dropped the box. She lifted the ring out carefully, reverently, like it was made of glass instead of steel. It was warm, as if it had just been taken off Tommy's finger, as if some part of him still lived in the metal. She slipped it onto her thumb, the only finger it would fit, and felt something inside her shift, like a piece of her that had been missing, torn out and lost, had suddenly clicked back into place. "Thank you," she whispered, the words completely inadequate for what she was feeling. "Thank you, thank you." Hawk placed his large, calloused hand on her shoulder and squeezed gently. "Your family, Eleanor. You always were. From the day Tommy brought you to the clubhouse with stars in his eyes and introduced you as his future wife. And you always will be. Death doesn't change that. Nothing changes that." They stayed at the cemetery for another 2 hours. The 13 riders and Eleanor. They didn't talk about leaving. Didn't check watches or phones. They just sat together around Tommy's grave, some on the grass, others perched on their bikes, and shared stories. Preacher went first. He told the one about the time Tommy tried to fix Gunner's carburetor with duct tape and zip ties because they were stuck in the middle of nowhere, Montana, and the nearest town was 80 miles away. Kid had no idea what he was doing, Preacher said with a laugh that rumbled up from his chest. But he was determined. Took him 4 hours and about half a roll of tape, but damn if he didn't get that engine running again. Sounded like a lawnmower with emphysema, but it got us to town. Gunner's bike smoked for 3 days after. Gunner grinned, showing the gap where he'd lost a tooth in a bar fight years ago. I was so mad at him, I didn't talk to him for a week. Then he showed up at my place with a 6-pack and a new carburetor he'd bought with money he didn't have, and I couldn't stay mad anymore. That was Tommy, heart bigger than his brain sometimes. Chains recalled the night Tommy challenged Reaper to an arm wrestling match at the clubhouse. Kid was drunk as a skunk, talking trash about how he'd been working out, how he was stronger now. Reaper tried to warn him off, but Tommy wouldn't listen. Match lasted maybe 3 seconds. Tommy lost so badly he couldn't lift a beer for 2 days. His whole arm was bruised from shoulder to wrist. Chains laughed, shaking his head. But you know what? The next week Tommy showed up with his arm in a sling and challenged Reaper to a rematch. Said he'd been practicing. Kid didn't know when to quit. Reaper smiled slightly, a rare expression on his usually stoic face. He never won, but he never stopped trying either. That was Tommy, stubborn as hell. Nomad, the oldest of them at 68, spoke quietly about the ride they'd taken through the Rockies one summer. We were doing a charity run, raising money for veterans, 500 miles over 3 days. Tommy's bike broke down on day 2. Clutch cable snapped right in the middle of nowhere, Wyoming. We were about to call a truck when Tommy noticed a family stranded on the side of the road. Old station wagon, hood up, mom and 3 kids looking scared. Tommy walked over there and spent the next 2 hours rebuilding their alternator with nothing but the tools in his saddlebag and some wire he pulled out of a fence post. Nomad's eyes were wet. Family wanted to pay him, tried to give him everything they had. Tommy wouldn't take it, just told them to pay it forward someday. Help someone else when they needed it. That's who he was. Eleanor listened to every story, her heart aching and swelling at the same time. She laughed, she cried, she added her own memories. The time Tommy tried to cook her a romantic dinner and set off the smoke alarm. The way he sang off-key in the shower every morning. How he'd bring home stray animals, cats, dogs, once even an injured owl, and nurse them back to health in their garage. How he'd hold her when she had nightmares and tell her stories until she fell back asleep. How he'd proposed to her at a truck stop diner at 3 in the morning because he couldn't wait another minute to make it official. Slowly, the knot in her chest continued to loosen. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it wasn't suffocating anymore. It was softer now, gentler, mixed with love and gratitude and the knowledge that Tommy had been real, had been loved, had left his mark on the world in ways both large and small. When the sun was high and warm and the morning chill had burned away completely, Hawk stood and stretched. His leather jacket creaked with the movement. "We should head out," he said. "Got a long ride back, but before we go..." He looked at Eleanor, his grey eyes serious. "We ride past your place every Sunday, rain or shine. Have been for 3 years, actually, even though you probably never noticed. If you ever want company, coffee, conversation, whatever, just put a red flag in your mailbox. Anything red, bandana cloth, doesn't matter. We'll see it and we'll stop." Eleanor's throat tightened. She nodded, not trusting her voice. Hawk continued, "And if you ever need anything, I mean anything at all, you call, day or night. Flat tire, broken furnace, bad dream, doesn't matter. We're here. That's the promise we made Tommy, and it's the promise we're making you now." One by one, the riders mounted their bikes. Engines roared to life, filling the air with thunder that echoed off the cemetery stones and made the ground vibrate beneath Eleanor's feet. They formed a line, Hawk at the front like always, and rolled slowly toward the cemetery gates. But before they left, each one paused beside Eleanor. A nod, a touch on the shoulder, a quiet word. "You're not alone." Preacher said. We got you, Gunner said. Family, Chains said simply. Reaper was the last. He stopped his bike beside her and looked down, his face still hidden behind those dark sunglasses, even though the sun was behind him. He loved you, Reaper said, his voice carrying clearly over the rumble of his engine. More than anything in this world or the next. More than riding. More than the club. More than his own life. Don't ever forget that. Eleanor swallowed hard past the lump in her throat. I won't, she managed to say. Reaper nodded once, sharp and final. Then he revved his engine and followed the others out onto the road, the sound fading slowly into the distance until there was only silence and birdsong and the whisper of wind through pine needles. Eleanor stood alone at the grave for a long time after they'd gone. She looked down at Tommy's name carved into the stone, at the flowers surrounding it in their riot of colour, at the jacket lying across the base like a watchful guardian. She knelt and placed her hand flat on the cold granite, feeling the sun-warmed stone beneath her palm. I'm sorry I stayed away so long, she whispered. I'm sorry I wasn't stronger, that I let the grief win. But I'm here now, and I'm not leaving you again, I promise. She sat there in the grass, Tommy's ring heavy and solid on her thumb, and felt the sun warm her face. Felt the wind move through her hair the way Tommy's fingers used to, and for the first time in 3 years, she felt something she'd thought was lost forever. Peace. Not happiness, not yet. Maybe not ever again in the way she'd known before, but peace, acceptance, the knowledge that Tommy had loved her, that he'd made sure she'd be taken care of, that she wasn't alone in her grief. She stayed until the sun was high overhead, and her stomach growled with hunger, and her back ached from sitting on the cold ground. Then she stood, brushed the grass and dirt from her jeans, and picked up the scattered wildflowers. She arranged them carefully around the headstone, adding them to the others, creating a rainbow of remembrance. Before she left, she touched the jacket one more time. Ran her fingers over the worn leather, traced the iron vow patch with her fingertip. Thank you, she whispered, to Tommy, to the club, to whatever force had brought her here today. Thank you for everything. Then she walked back to her car, started the engine, and drove home through the bright October afternoon. If you're enjoying this story, hit that like button. It helps us bring you more content like this. Eleanor didn't put the flag out the first Sunday after her visit to the cemetery, or the second. She told herself she needed more time, that she wasn't ready, that seeing them again, inviting them into her space, into the small, quiet life she'd built in her grief, would be too much, too overwhelming. She'd managed this long alone. She could keep managing. But on the third Sunday, November 15th, 2025, she woke up early with Tommy's ring still on her thumb and the blue paisley bandana spread across her nightstand where she could see it first thing every morning. The house was silent and cold. She'd stopped turning on the heat in most of the rooms to save money. Stopped cooking real meals because what was the point when you were eating alone? Stopped doing a lot of things that used to matter. She made coffee in the same chipped mug she'd been using for 3 years, sat at the kitchen table in the weak morning light, and looked at the calendar hanging on the wall. Sundays were circled in red pen, not because they meant anything special, just because they were empty, blank spaces in a life that felt increasingly blank itself. The house creaked around her. The refrigerator hummed. A neighbor's dog barked somewhere down the street. Normal sounds, but they felt hollow, like she was living in a house instead of a home. Eleanor set down her coffee mug and walked to the hall closet. She dug through boxes of winter clothes and old blankets until she found what she was looking for, an old red bandana, one of Tommy's. Actually, he'd left a dozen of them scattered around the house, in drawers and coat pockets and hanging from doorknobs. This one was faded from too many washes, the edges frayed, but it was still vibrant enough to see from the road. She carried it outside in her bathrobe and slippers, her breath misting in the cold November air. The street was quiet. Most of her neighbors were still asleep. She tied the bandana to the mailbox post, making sure the knot was secure, making sure it hung where it would be visible. Then she stood back and looked at it. The red fabric moved slightly in the breeze, like a flag of surrender, or invitation, or both. Her heart pounded, her hands trembled. Part of her wanted to snatch it down, to run back inside and lock the door and pretend she'd never put it there. But another part, a deeper part, the part that had been so desperately lonely for so long, made her leave it hanging. She went back inside, showered, dressed in actual clothes for the first time in weeks, and tried to keep herself busy. She cleaned the kitchen, folded laundry, vacuumed the living room. But every few minutes she found herself walking to the window and looking out at the mailbox, at the red flag still hanging there, still visible. They showed up at noon, exactly. She heard them before she saw them, that unmistakable rumble of multiple motorcycles moving in formation down her quiet suburban street. Her neighbors would hate her. Mrs. Chen next door was probably already calling the police, but Eleanor didn't care. She stood at her living room window and watched as 13 motorcycles rolled slowly down the street and pulled into her driveway one by one, their chrome gleaming in the afternoon sun. Hawk was first off his bike. He removed his helmet, ran a hand through his silver hair, and looked up at the house. Eleanor's breath caught. For a moment she couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then Hawk smiled, and that warm, knowing smile, and walked toward the porch. Eleanor met him at the door before he could knock. She opened it and stood there, suddenly self-conscious about her faded jeans and old sweatshirt, about the house behind her that probably smelled like dust and grief. "Coffee?" Hawk asked, his voice gentle, like he knew exactly how hard this was for her. Eleanor's throat was tight, but she managed to smile. "Already brewing," she said. "Come in." They came inside, all 13 of them, filling her small house with leather and the smell of road dust and motor oil and cigarettes, and something indefinably masculine that she'd missed more than she'd realized. They were too big for her furniture, too loud for her quiet space, and absolutely, perfectly welcome. Preacher brought homemade cinnamon rolls from a bakery on the other side of town, still warm in their white paper bag. "My sister owns the place," he explained, setting them on her kitchen table. "Makes these every Sunday morning. Figured you might want some." Gunnar brought a jug of apple cider from a farm stand, the kind that wasn't pasteurized and had little bits of pulp floating in it. "Good for the soul," he said, pouring it into mismatched glasses. Chains brought a deck of worn playing cards and spent the afternoon teaching Eleanor how to play poker the way they played it on the road, fast and dirty, with chips made from her spare buttons and pennies, with rules that changed depending on who was dealing and how much coffee everyone had consumed. They stayed for hours, sprawled in her living room, perched on her kitchen counters, standing in her hallway because there wasn't enough room for everyone to sit. They told more stories about Tommy, laughed until tears streamed down their faces, argued good-naturedly about which route was best for getting through the Appalachians, showed her photos on their phones of rides and rallies and brothers who'd passed on. And slowly, imperceptibly, Eleanor's house started to feel like a home again. The silence was replaced with laughter and conversation. The cold was replaced with warmth and presence. The loneliness was replaced with something she'd thought she'd never feel again, belonging. When they finally left, as the sun was setting, painting her small front yard in shades of gold and amber, Eleanor stood on her porch and watched them ride away. The red flag still hung from her mailbox, moving gently in the evening breeze. Hawk was the last to leave. He paused at the bottom of her porch steps and looked up at her. "Same time next week?" he asked. Eleanor nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat. "Good," Hawk said. He put on his helmet, swung his leg over his bike, and started the engine, but before he pulled away, he looked back at her one more time. "Proud of you, Eleanor," he said. "Tommy would be too." Then he was gone, his taillight disappearing around the corner. Eleanor stood on her porch until full dark, the red flag still hanging from her mailbox. And for the first time since Tommy died, she went to bed that night without crying herself to sleep. She put the flag out every Sunday after that. The weeks that followed fell into a rhythm Eleanor hadn't known she needed. Every Sunday, she tied the red bandana to her mailbox. Every Sunday the motorcycles came, sometimes all 13, sometimes more, as other members of Iron Vow heard about the widow who'd finally opened her door, sometimes fewer when road or weather or life got in the way. But they always came. Always. It started to change her, slowly, imperceptibly at first, like ice melting so gradually you don't notice, until suddenly there's water where solid ground used to be. She started cooking again. Real food, not just microwave dinners eaten standing over the sink. She made Tommy's favorite chili recipe when she knew the riders were coming, and they ate 3 pots of it and declared her a saint. She baked cookies and bread and pies, filling her kitchen with smells she'd forgotten, with warmth she'd missed. She started leaving her house for things other than work and groceries. Preacher invited her to a charity motorcycle show, and she went, standing in a field full of chrome and leather and feeling Tommy's presence in every engine that roared to life. Gunnar asked her to help at a toy drive for underprivileged kids, and she spent a Saturday afternoon wrapping presents and realized she was smiling for the first time in months. She started talking about Tommy without breaking down, started saying his name out loud instead of just thinking it, started remembering the good times, his laugh, his terrible jokes, the way he'd dance with her in the kitchen with no music playing, without immediately spiraling into the darkness of his death. The riders became family in ways she hadn't expected. They fixed things around her house without being asked. Chains replaced her broken garbage disposal. Nomad patched her roof. Reaper changed her oil and rotated her tires. They showed up when she had bad days, somehow always knowing when she needed company. They texted her memes and photos and random thoughts. They included her in their group chats and their planning sessions and their lives. And slowly, Eleanor started to heal. Not fully, not completely. The grief was still there, a constant companion that colored everything. But it was softer now, more bearable, like a weight she'd learned to carry instead of one that crushed her. On Christmas, they invited her to the clubhouse for dinner. She almost said no, almost stayed home alone with Tommy's ghost and a bottle of wine like she had the previous 2 years. But then she thought about the red flag, about the promise Tommy had made them keep, about the family he'd given her even in death. So she went. The clubhouse was decorated with twinkling lights and a slightly crooked Christmas tree, and a banner that said, "Welcome home, Eleanor," in letters that looked like they'd been painted by children. 30 riders and their families filled the space, wives and girlfriends and kids running around playing with toy motorcycles. They'd made a place for her at the head table, right next to the empty chair they always kept for fallen brothers. They'd labeled the empty chair with a placard, "Tommy Hart, Forever Iron Vow." Eleanor cried when she saw it, but they were good tears, healing tears. She stayed until midnight, eating and laughing and telling stories. She held babies and played cards and felt for a few hours like she was part of something bigger than her grief. When Hawk drove her home that night, she'd had too much spiked eggnog to drive herself. He walked her to her door and paused before leaving. "You know what Tommy told me once?" Hawk said, his breath misting in the cold December air. "About 6 months before he died. We were working on his bike in the garage, and he got real quiet. Then he said, 'If anything happens to me, Eleanor's gonna try to disappear. She'll think she has to carry it alone, but she doesn't. She's got us. Make sure she knows that.' I promised him I would. Took me 3 years, but I kept that promise." Eleanor's eyes welled up. She reached out and squeezed Hawk's hand. "Thank you for not giving up on me." "Family doesn't give up," Hawk said simply. "See you Sunday." The weeks turned into months. Winter gave way to spring. Eleanor started sleeping better, started eating regular meals, started answering her phone when her sister called instead of letting it go to voicemail. She joined the auxiliary chapter of Iron Vow, the organization for riders' families, and helped organize fundraisers and charity events. She found purpose again in helping others, in honoring Tommy's memory, by doing the kind of good he'd always done. On Valentine's Day, she went to the cemetery alone for the first time since October. She brought red roses and sat by Tommy's grave for an hour, talking to him like he was still there, telling him about her week, about the riders who'd become her family, about how she was learning to live again without forgetting him. "I miss you every day," she whispered, tracing his name on the headstone, "but I'm okay now. Finally, because of what you did, because you made sure I wouldn't be alone. I love you, always." The wind moved through the pine trees, and Eleanor could almost hear his voice in it. "I love you too. Now go live." So she did. Spring brought new beginnings. Eleanor planted flowers in her front yard for the first time in 3 years. Purple asters and goldenrod, the wildflowers Tommy used to pick for her. Her neighbors commented on how much better the house looked, how much better she looked. The grief lines around her eyes had softened. Her smile came easier now. On April 15th, Hawk called her with an unexpected invitation. "We're doing a memorial ride next month," he said. "Cross-country, hitting all the places Tommy loved. We want you there. But Eleanor—" He paused. "We want you to ride." Eleanor's breath caught. "Hawk, I haven't been on a bike since the accident. I can't—" "Tommy's bike is still in your garage," Hawk interrupted gently. "We checked when we fixed your hot water heater last month. It's been sitting there for 3 years under that tarp. We can get it running again, if you want to. No pressure, but I think it's time." Eleanor closed her eyes. Tommy's Harley. The bike he'd loved more than anything except her, the one he'd spent countless hours maintaining and customizing. She'd covered it the day after his funeral and hadn't looked at it since, couldn't bear to. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. "You don't have to decide now," Hawk said. "Think about it. We've got 3 weeks before the ride. If you change your mind, we're here." Eleanor thought about it for days, weeks. She'd wake up in the middle of the night and pace her house, Tommy's ring heavy on her thumb. She'd stand in the garage doorway and stare at the tarp-covered shape in the corner, her heart pounding. Finally, on May 1st, she called Hawk back. "Let's do it," she said, her voice shaking but determined. "Let's get the bike running." They came the next Sunday, not just the core 13, but 20 riders with tools and expertise and patience. Eleanor led them to the garage and pulled off the tarp with trembling hands. The bike looked exactly as Tommy had left it. Dusty, neglected, but still beautiful. Still his. They worked all day and into the evening. Preacher rebuilt the carburetor while explaining each step to Eleanor. Gunner replaced the tires and showed her how to check the pressure. Chains cleaned and polished every inch of chrome until it gleamed. Reaper changed the oil and flushed the brake lines. Nomad rewired the electrical system and got the headlight blazing bright. Eleanor helped with everything, learning as she went, getting grease under her fingernails, asking questions, remembering the times she'd watched Tommy do this same work, how patient he'd been teaching her, how much he'd loved the ritual of maintaining his machine. By sunset, the bike was running. The engine purred like it had never been silent. The chrome reflected the golden light. It looked ready to ride. Hawk handed Eleanor a helmet, not hers but Tommy's, the one with the Iron Vow sticker and the scratches from 1,000 miles. "Take her for a spin," he said softly. Eleanor's hands shook as she took the helmet. She looked at the bike, at the expectant faces around her, at the sun setting through the garage door. She thought about Tommy, about fear, about promises, about living instead of just surviving. She put on the helmet, swung her leg over the seat. It felt right, like coming home. She turned the throttle, the engine roared, and then she was moving, down the driveway, onto the street, into the wind. Her heart pounded with fear and exhilaration, and something that felt almost like joy. She rode for 2 hours, through her neighborhood, past the cemetery where Tommy rested, out onto the highway where he died, facing that fear head-on. And she didn't cry, she just rode, and felt alive. When she returned, the riders were still there, waiting. They'd cracked open beers and started a fire pit in her backyard. When she pulled into the driveway and cut the engine, they erupted in cheers and applause. Eleanor removed her helmet, her hair wild, her cheeks flushed, her eyes bright. She was grinning like she hadn't grinned in years. "I'm in," she said. "For the memorial ride, I'm in." Hawk smiled and raised his beer. "Welcome back, rider." The memorial ride began on May 28, 2026, exactly a year and a half after Eleanor's first return to the cemetery. 32 riders gathered at dawn in the Pinewood Cemetery parking lot. They stood in a circle around Tommy's grave, helmets in hand, heads bowed. Preacher led a prayer. For all the brothers and sisters who've ridden ahead of us. For Tommy Hart, who rides with us still in spirit. For the roads that bind us and the memories that keep us strong. We ride in their honor, we carry their legacy, until we meet again. Until we meet again, the riders echoed. Eleanor placed fresh flowers on Tommy's grave, purple asters and goldenrod, tied with the blue paisley bandana. She touched the headstone one last time. "Come with me," she whispered. "Let's ride." They headed west, following the routes Tommy had loved, through the Smoky Mountains where the morning mist clung to the valleys, across Tennessee's rolling hills, through Arkansas's winding back roads. They stopped at diners Tommy had frequented where waitresses still remembered that polite boy with the big smile. They camped under stars he'd slept beneath. They visited roadside memorials where other riders had fallen. Eleanor rode every mile, sometimes with the pack, sometimes alone, but never lonely. She felt Tommy in the wind against her face, in the rumble of the engine between her legs, in the freedom of the open road. They reached the Grand Canyon on day 9, stood at the rim as the sun set, painting the ancient stone in shades of amber and crimson and gold. 32 riders standing shoulder to shoulder, watching something vast and eternal. Hawk turned to Eleanor. "How you feeling?" Eleanor smiled, tears streaming down her face. But they were good tears, grateful tears. "I feel like I'm home," she said. "You are home," Reaper said quietly beside her. "You've been home since you put that red flag out, since you opened your door, since you decided to live again." They scattered Tommy's ashes that night. Eleanor had been carrying them in a small urn the entire trip. She released them into the canyon winds, watching them dance and swirl and disappear into the vast darkness. "Thank you for loving me," she whispered into the wind. "Thank you for giving me this family. Thank you for teaching me how to live with honor and ride with freedom. I'll carry you with me always." The wind answered with a sound like distant engines, like laughter, like home. They rode back slowly, taking 12 days instead of 9, stopping whenever something called to them. Eleanor led them to the spot where she and Tommy had watched that last sunset together. They stood there in silence, honoring the memory of a man who'd loved deeply and lived fully and left the world better than he'd found it. When they finally returned to Pinewood on June 18, 2026, Eleanor didn't feel like she was ending a journey. She felt like she was beginning one. The riders helped her park Tommy's bike in the garage, but this time she didn't cover it with a tarp. She left it gleaming and ready, positioned where she could see it every day. A reminder, a promise, a beginning. As the others said their goodbyes and prepared to leave, Hawk pulled Eleanor aside one last time. "Tommy would be proud of you," he said. "Hell, we're all proud of you." Eleanor looked at the 13 men who'd become her brothers, who'd kept a promise when it would have been easier to forget, who'd given her back her life. "I couldn't have done this without you," she said. "That's what family's for," Hawk said. He pulled out one final item from his jacket, a leather patch identical to the one they'd given her at the cemetery, but with a new addition stitched beneath her name, Road Captain, Honored Rider. "You're one of us now," he said, "not just in name, not just in memory, your iron vow. You've earned it on the road, the way it's meant to be earned." Eleanor took the patch with trembling hands and pressed it to her heart. She looked around at the faces of her family, scarred and weathered and beautiful. She thought about Tommy, about grief and healing, about promises kept and roads traveled, about how sometimes the end of one journey is just the beginning of another. "Same time next Sunday?" she asked, smiling through her tears. "Same time next Sunday," Hawk confirmed, "and every Sunday after that, for as long as you want us." "Forever then," Eleanor said. "Family forever." The riders mounted their bikes one final time. Engines roared to life, filling the quiet suburban street with thunder. They rolled away in formation, Hawk at the front, their chrome gleaming in the afternoon sun. Eleanor stood in her driveway and watched them go. Tommy's ring solid and warm on her thumb, the memorial patch clutched in her hand, the red flag still hanging from her mailbox, faded now from months of sun and rain, but still visible, still there. She looked up at the sky, clear and blue and infinite, and smiled. "Until we ride again," she whispered. And somewhere in the wind, she could have sworn she heard Tommy's voice answering back, "Until we ride again, my love. Until we ride again." Thank you so much for watching this story. If it touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our next upload. These stories of loyalty, family, and redemption remind us what truly matters in life. See you in the next one. Ride safe, and remember, family is forever.